As Muslims, we have a responsibility towards Allah in regards to His creation. I'll talk to Muslim sustainability leaders worldwide on the new Stewards Podcast. We'll discuss our challenges, emerging solutions, and how we can all make a difference. My name is Ilyas, and I've been working on sustainability for over 10 years. I'm grateful that you've joined us on this journey as we explore what it means to be a steward of the earth. Today, we're honored to welcome Shaykh Muhammad Foulds, founder and teacher at the organization Hearts Sea, and head imam and principal of religious affairs in the UK Prison Service. With a rich background in human ecology and conservation, Shaykh Foulds has spent over 20 years as a professional falconer and held leadership roles in wildlife conservation, including director of Lincolnshire Wildlife Park. His journey to Islam adds depth to his ecological work as he develops nature-inspired pathways for spiritual and personal growth. Shaykh Foulds' work with the Prince's Trust and the Al-Maqasid Institute aims to bring environmental awareness into religious education and community support. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shaykh.
Wa alaikum
Pleasure to have you.
salam wa rahmatullahi, inshallah. Good to be with you, and thank you for inviting me, inshallah.
It's a pleasure. I'd like to just dive into it immediately and discover more about who you are and what has brought you on your path towards where you are now. What initially inspired your interest in ecology, and then what was the role of ecology in your journey towards Islam? Because obviously ecology is a very central theme within your life and almost always has been, perhaps.
Yes, I suppose I have to go back to childhood. My father was working and spent his life working in what we have here in the UK is known as the Forestry Commission. And he had a number of roles there, but he always used to take me where he could into the forest and get me involved in different animal counts. So just being in that natural environment, and of course, as I grew up, we lived in the countryside. So that was my initiation. I always remember when I was young in the school holidays, always wanting I used to go out for hours and hours into the farmers' fields and just roam about. And then my love really for wildlife blossomed, and particularly birds of prey, falcons and hawks and eagles and owls, hawks. And that developed into falconry, the art of falconry. And it's there where I began to see things and understand things completely different to how at that particular time in my life, how I was then taught, how I had been taught in school in relation to biology and, subjects in relation to the natural world, and also in college and university, so I was seeing something from a classroom perspective and research, which wasn't making sense to what I was actually seeing in real life, particularly working in the natural world, working with wild animals, birds of prey. I began to start to see things outside the box, and that's what ecology means. It's about the study of relationships. So although my title, one of many, is known as, in my first university sort of introduction, was then to become a raptor biologist, which many people think is the study of dinosaurs. But raptor is a French word, which means to seize with your feet. So that's something that's very special and unique to falcons, hawks, and eagles. They seize with their feet. They use their beak, but they seize with their feet. So as a biologist, obviously I'm studying about the life of species, which zones me in, but that's how I left the theoretical aspect. But because, alhamdulillah, and we're talking about a time before I became Muslim, I was then understanding all of that outside in the natural world. I was seeing something completely different. And that's when I really understood I sort of transferred from biology, which is important, to then the study of ecology. And then that led me then into becoming a human ecologist. And then we developed from there.
So what what were you seeing? So you had this study in class, a mainly theoretical view of nature,
Mm.
and then during your actual work, you noticed that these two views didn't match. What were some of the main differences between your theoretical and your practical education?
I think particularly in relation to birds of prey, because obviously when I was working with captive bred species, so particularly when I was director of a number of birds of prey centres and the Lincolnshire Birds of Prey Centre, one of the largest in the whole of the UK. So all of my birds are captive bred in breeding projects, but they're still wild. So I was also I was flying them and hunting them, and obviously the eagles and the falcons and the hawks, they're flying in the natural environment, so they're going to hit thermals and go up to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 feet. And there you've got no control of the bird. The only connection between you and this beautiful species is on respect, you know, um, and that can be broken at any time. And so when you're working with an eagle, for example, that's 2,000, 3,000 feet up and it's just soaring. Birds of prey are sort of known as the dominating sort of corner species within a ecology, and they sort of control the airspace. And you automatically, once you see a bird of prey high in the sky, you're going to see a predator, and predators are going to bring in alarm bells from all other creation, be it other birds, other animals. So, by working with training birds of prey high in the sky, you're not just focusing on the bird itself and what it's doing. You're beginning to see everything that's taking place away from the bird, to your left, to your right, and also at ground level. And of course, there's times when you're working with birds of prey, and we deal with that as a subject, where you've got no idea where they are. They could be chasing prey and they could be a long way away from you. So how do you locate them? And that's where you begin to go out of that classroom understanding to begin to learn how to read the natural world, because birds of prey are predators. So they're the dominating species. So all other creation is going to I give you a signpost as to where that bird is, and so that's the main difference, and that opened up so many other channels for me.
SubhanAllah. Yeah. So obviously, relationships play quite a big role within ecology as well, right? It's about how everything is related or interlinked or connected to each other. Um, what was the purpose of or the role of your relationship to creation in your journey towards Islam? Or did that play a role at all?
I didn't think so, but it did, because obviously I I had a deep love for all nature, and obviously that led me into specialize in the study of birds of prey. That's another subject, because I argue that we're in a world of becoming um, specialists in, you must become an engineer, you must become a doctor, but that's not the world uh, that was around us, before the 15th century. It was a world where you were polymaths, and that's what we need. But anyway, at that particular point, before becoming Muslim, I did specialize, moving away from the general understanding of birds of prey, eagles, hawks, and falcons, and owls, to move into the study of vultures. And vultures have had a very sort of dismal, negative sort of view in the world, but very crucial in relation to the whole of the ecosystem. And the role that it plays. And so I became probably one of the most leading, vulture experts in the UK. And I was involved in a number of research programs abroad. And that led me then to um, be involved in a partnership with the Saudi Arabian Wildlife Department. They heard about the work that I was doing and my background, my experience and expertise. And they had a problem with a species of vulture called a griffon vulture, very large vulture. And their colony of birds was down in the southwest mountains, and they wanted me to go over to Saudi and to research and to find out why the population was declining. So we looked at a number of areas, and so while this was going on, obviously I was lecturing in animal care colleges here in the UK. And so through that specialization of vultures, then the door opened for me to my journey of becoming Muslim.
Really? How come?
Because I was going back and forth over a period of about 3 years. And so the vulture colony was roughly 8,000 feet up, way in the mountains in the southwest. And I always, before my sort of, adventure into Saudi Arabia, I always thought it's just going to be mountains and desert, but it's in the area that I was based in the southwest, not too far from the Yemen border. It's lush green, snow, savanna.
Mm.
And so the vulture colony was 8,000 feet up. And I was based up there in some sort of, there was an old derelict hotel which the Saudi Arabian Wildlife Department organised for me to go and stay in. I was the only one there because there was no one there, and it was just run by a caretaker.
Mm.
And it was literally built on the edge of this mountain, which
Wow.
was perfect. It overlooked the colony, and it was completely above all the clouds. And just literally out of the blue, this one morning, although I had heard of the call of the prayer, every time I used to land in Jeddah or Riyadh, I'd hear the call of prayer. Had no effect on me. But this particular time, the call of the Fajr prayer echoed through the mountains. And that's when it clicked. And then I was then pulled towards the religion. And I accepted Islam in the very village that I was doing my research in.
Wow. SubhanAllah. Okay. Well, that is interesting. So you
Yeah,
actually had a call of nature in a way, but in the natural. That's
yeah.
interesting.
And it was interesting because then when I came back and my journey sort of began, then and I was doing a lot of media work, etc. And then the BBC heard about my sort of conversion because obviously before I became Muslim, although I was a biologist, and that sort of the history, sort of which you cannot escape when you study biology or ecology at university. Um, you have to go down the line of evolution and the theory of evolution and Darwinism. So before I became Muslim, I was 100%, Darwinist, and I used to preach, the facts that we came out of trees and monkeys and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but before that, a number of years way back when I was 18, 19, I was training to become a Christian minister. And so, I've got a good background of understanding of all sort of areas. Um, but and so, yes, because I was sponsored by Saudi Arabian Airlines and British Aerospace, so that's the story of this Englishman. It was all over the papers in Saudi. Oh no, we've got an Englishman in
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia. He's in the mountains.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
He's wildlife expert. He's here. He's here to save a key species for Saudi Arabia.
Mm,
And they used to come all up in the mountains to watch me and observe me. And so
interesting.
the BBC done a big documentary on me.
Really? Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that still up
I
to
think
watch?
so. It's some years back. It was called My Name is Mohammed.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll see if I can find it. If I can, I will put it in the show notes. Sure. So then I didn't realize, obviously, that as an ecologist, then accepting Islam, there was not only your like immediate religious journey in becoming a Muslim, but also then sort of a professional journey in perhaps uh, holding some of the doctrines that you had accepted as true to review them in light of Islam. Was that difficult for you to do? For example, the Darwinistic angle.
It's funny because on that last trip, in fact, the I've got to tell you this: the research on behalf of the Saudi Wildlife Department that they asked me to do in relation to the griffon vulture has not been completed after all these years. Believe me, I
Mm,
have tried to get back. I have tried to complete this particular research, which is why is the species declining?
mm.
And I was looking at human disturbance, poisoning, persecution. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasn't opened the doors for me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has opened the doors for me to do Umrah, to do Hajj. You know, when I
Alhamdulillah.
becoming Muslim, I studied in Taif. But to complete my research, it's a no-go area. So
Mm,
subhanAllah, when I look back, you know, my whole purpose was not to go there to do the research. It was, inshallah ta'ala, alhamdulillah, subhanAllah, to become Muslim. But
yeah.
when I used to go over there, obviously I was lecturing in animal care colleges, farming colleges here. And I remember when I came back as a Muslim and I went back into the same classroom and I returned to the same textbook that I left, that I was teaching my students, I looked at it and I thought, subhanAllah, everything I'm teaching now, I've just realized it's all now in the Quran. So
Oh,
I was seeing something completely different. So my whole approach to teaching completely changed. So the
oh,
lessons took on a new meaning.
subhanallah. Okay. When was this? Like in sense of time?
1992, 1993.
Okay. SubhanAllah. So you've been teaching for over 30 years.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And then, so like years down the line, you start the organization Hearts Sea
Mm.
with the purpose, once again, to teach some of these lessons that you've come upon, and that um, well, to help people see something, I guess. So, what is the purpose of Hearts See, and what are we supposed to see as Muslims or people in general? I'm not sure if you teach to a certain audience or not.
I suppose that journey began is obviously when I came back from Saudi Arabia, um, as a Muslim, you know, I, like all who revert or convert, although I don't like that term, I had that thirst to learn the ilm. And so I approached a number of ulama, and so they sent me abroad for a number of years to become alim. I graduated, then become an alim in 2006. So going down that path of understanding Nahwa and Solf and, you know, the deep Arabic. Um, uh, Before that, I had the translation. So I was looking at all of the ayats in relation to the natural world, but it's not until you begin to understand the language of the Quran, that's when it opened my eyes. SubhanAllah, you know, everything that I've learned in my life, it's all there. And of course, much, much more. And I began wanting to reach out to scholars and madrasas and maktabs and Islamic institutes to teach this. And there was just no sort of interest. So then I just decided, then I realized, you know, subhanAllah, how throughout the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to look, to observe, to ponder, to reflect, and why Allah uses different words depending on, you know, where the word is in a particular ayat and surah. Why does Allah say observe here in relation to perhaps some fruit? And why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say look here in relation to perhaps the tree? Why is that taking place, and how it all connects to the different levels of tafakkur, contemplation. And then how it all really comes back to the heart, the qalb. And then I was doing research with an organization in America called HeartMath, where they were uncovering that the heart itself has a brain. And it's the heart that actually thinks before the main brain. Then I was working with them, getting them to understand everything from the Islamic perspective, how the Prophet taught, and, about that if there's one piece of flesh that is sound, that the rest of the body is sound. Their research was also saying it, but obviously not from a religious perspective. And the ayats in relation to the heart, and the only thing that will help us when we are in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be the qalb as-salim. So I thought, that's that's it. I've got to set up an organization, focus on the heart, and the heart that sees.
Yeah.
And so, with the word see, I was trying to look at the heart that sees, and I was trying to think of all of the society that's completely broken down. That's just thinking in terms of isolation, separation, this, whether it's the economic, the social, the educational system. So I was trying to sort of break it down into, different areas. So I just call it hearts see.
Mm.
So by getting the heart to see, which is fundamentally to think, that's where we're going to start to think outside the box. And that's the only way that we can understand the Quran through this Quranic lens, which is through an ecological lens in terms of relationships.
So then is ecology a method for looking at the Quran, or do you see it as essential for understanding the Quran? Because are I can imagine that ecology is a way to look at the Quran, right? But that there could be different, like a chemist could perhaps make the same argument for his or her field of work.
Yes, I mean, how, I mean, both ways are important, to home in and to focus on a particular word, to understand that particular word, and then look at perhaps more the whole sort of ayat. And so that opened up another area of study where I began to then understand more about the brain hemispheres, the left brain hemisphere, the right brain hemisphere. And one of my teachers, Professor Ian McGillicuddy, one of the most senior neuroscientists in the world, who has researched the brain hemispheres and concluded that the left brain hemisphere zooms in, isolates, it just focuses on the object, and the right brain hemisphere looks at everything in terms of relationships. And both are essential, both need to work together. And that's how we should view the Quran, because obviously throughout the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding us to look at all of the signs in the universe. So that's thinking in terms of ecology and relationships. And then he'll focus in on, why don't you look at the tree? Why don't you look at the bee? Why don't you look at the flower or the ant? So you are zooming in, and to understand the greater picture, you've got to understand about the species and everything. So that's the biology with the ecology. And then when you're learning uh, to understand the Quran much more deeper, particularly entering the Arabic language, then you would take one ayat, and then you need to know, where is the verb, where's the object, where's the subject, and why is that verse constructed how it is. And then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, look at the divine order, and then, then you begin to question, as ulama of the past, and alhamdulillah, some of my teachers now of today are realizing that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the universe in perfect order and it's all working together, okay, which we can say
Mhm.
sits under the umbrella of ecology, then would not, the question is, would not the creator then bring down the final revelation also in complete order? Would he have delivered the final blueprint for humanity in chaos? Of course not. It's in perfect harmony. And that connects to the first ayat revealed to the Prophet in the cave of Hira.
Yeah. SubhanAllah. What what would you say is the main thing that people that do not look to achieve this understanding of the Quran are missing? Because I think for a lot of people, the connection to nature is not a common one,
No.
especially people in cities, especially in these times.
Mm.
It's a really a big challenge, right, for people to
Yes.
have even a connection to their food. There are reports of kids thinking their meat comes from a factory or their milk. So what are people missing within their lives that you think this method of teaching that you have can bring them?
Well, we need to go back to that first ayat revealed to the Prophet. "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq." So what was the Prophet doing in the cave? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to continually ask questions: what, when, why, where, how. And they are the hallmarks of journalism. What, when, why, where, how. They're the hallmarks of a scientist like myself. And we've stopped thinking now because Allah wants us to think. So what was the Prophet himself, peace and blessings be on him, doing in the cave? He was making tafakkur. And what was he looking at? He was looking at creation. So we learn from our senior ulama that the first ayat is a command directly to the Prophet, and of course to us, to ponder about the macro, the universal sign. And if you look at that the verb, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq," when you look for the verb, you should then think, okay, so where's the object? And it's called a transitive verb. So the object is not something specific, but all of creation. So the command to the Prophet is, who's behind all of this? Who's creating all of this? And then the second ayat is where the last one then turns it to talk about the embryo and the development. So we're going macro and micro.
Hmm.
And then we have to ask ourselves, why is it throughout the Quran so many ayats are referring to the natural world? But we're living now in a world, and it's been designed perfectly, and obviously it's from the strategy a'udhu billah from shaitan to disconnect us from the ayats, to disconnect us from the natural world, because shaitan was in the company of the angels, shaitan was in the company of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and has seen the divine order. And so obviously we understand that shaitan is our key enemy and has his number of shayateen, the soldiers, with him. So needs to keep humanity from connecting to the signs. So we see though now that 99.99% of humanity is just looking down at the iPhone, the iPad, and not looking up. Once we start to look up, then shaitan knows we're going to make those connections, and we're going to think, and we're going to ponder, and we're going to reflect. And shaitan knows that our iman is also weak, and that there are a number of surahs that come together in the Quran which reflect the what was taking place after the migration from Mecca to Medina. So when they moved from Mecca to Medina and the Islamic State was being established, then because of the hypocrites and other groups, the iman in a number of areas dipped. And so these key surahs that come together, and they open by saying, why don't you look at creation, how it's continually in the tasbih, the, the, the glorification, the praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why don't you be like creation? So that's another door
Mm.
for us to go through. Yeah, okay, so we need to understand how the creation, because the creation is also Muslim, how are they praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And I think it's because we've lost this relationship with the natural world, which is the greatest of all creation, and because of the world that we are living in and the strategies of shaitan, that we need to return to the Quran, because in the Quran, to understand all of these signs, we have to refer to what some of our ulama refer to, and it's not a literal book, it's called Kitab al-Kawn. Because when we go back to the first ayah, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq," read in the name of your Rabb. Okay, so I'm a new Muslim or born Muslim. I need to learn the Arabic language. So that's one journey. Your maktab, your madrasa, your Islamic institute. But how then do I read all of the signs, the verses, the ayah in relation to the natural world? That's another question. So that's when, to learn those signs, we also have to learn the language of nature. So like the Quran is one, it's the Quran, the revelation, and within that, we call it the Kitab al-Kawn, the book of nature. So we have to learn that language of nature, which superimposes itself on the revelation. So when Allah says to study the tree, we learn everything in relation to the surah, to the ayat, and then we transfer and we go outside and then learn everything there and then come back to the ayat. And lastly, remember that the revelation was revealed in the natural world. It wasn't revealed in a maktab or madrasa or an Islamic institute.
Yeah. Jazakallah khair. So what does that mean for someone who wants to have this deeper understanding of the Quran and wants to get closer to Allah? Um, so there is I understand what you're saying. There's this link between the Quran and Khalqullah, and these two are extremely interconnected. They cannot be separated from each other. And the Quran points towards creation. Creation points towards the Quran, right? So they refer to each other and invite you to come to the other. How do I make that practical? Where does that start, and what is the effect that should have on my worship, perhaps as well?
Yeah. So, we have to, again, we return, in order to go forward, we have to go back. So we just return to the first ayat, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. So why was the Prophet in the cave? Because he was deeply in love with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of the environment of the Quraysh people, which was involved in shirk. He had to go, what I would say is he had to go off grid. He had to come out of that environment and reconnect, retune. And so the first principle of Heartsea is to rewire. But that's how we need to be in society today. We need to rewire, because how we're being programmed to think it's a world we're completely separated from nature and the divine. So the Prophet himself, peace and blessing upon him, was in the cave contemplating about creation. So that's what I teach my students to do, is you need to make the effort, and it requires effort. There's no point making the intention and then leaving it as that. Make the effort to go outside, into a forest, into a wood, and to be amongst the trees, amongst the forest, because you're not just amongst trees. You have to get into this mindset that you are amongst Muslims. Why am I saying that? Because that's what Allah is saying. He's saying to the believers after Mecca to Medina, why are you not like the Muslims in creation? The tree, the sun, the bird, the insect, the cloud are all in ibadah. They're all worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they are Muslims. So be amongst the Muslims and start to just walk, think, tune in, begin to use your ears and begin to use your eyes, because the ears and the eyes are the two senses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continually focuses on for us to use in the Quran. And it's those, particularly the munafiqeen, the munafiq, who don't use the ears and the eyes. They are the ones that become like the cattle, or even worse than the cattle. So by tuning in, we call it in Heartsea sit spot. Go out there, tune in, and it would take time because we're not used to it. We can't concentrate now, and it takes time to reprogram, to begin just to sit there, to connect, to look, to listen. And then we introduce different tools like a nature journal, and we begin to get students to think outside the box. And that's the introduction to ecology. And step by step, we introduce them to ayats in the Quran, and it's transition to transformation, which is what is needed. But we're following the same path, inshallah ta'ala, that the Prophet went through from the cave, or
Mhm.
into the cave, and then from there onwards.
Interesting. How long does it take on average for someone? So sorry, you're mentioning sit spots. So you go out there, you sit in the forest or near a tree, and what are you doing when you sit over there? Because
As a
some
ti-
people just see a tree,
yeah,
right?
I mean, there was a time when you could do a YouTube video. We have a YouTube channel, and everyone was doing 20 minutes. But, Shaitan's very clever now that humanity can't even think, can't focus on for no more than 2 minutes.
Mm,
And so whether we're taking children out or adults, we start small. Just for 5 minutes, if you can, just sit by, for example, a favorite tree that you like, that you feel you're drawn toward, and just sit there for 5 minutes and just look around. And then we move on to, okay, now in the same location, just use your ears and just listen. And then we go home, we reflect, we come back the next day. It's over like a 5-day period. And then we return to the same exercise, but now we have a nature journal. So whatever they're hearing, they put a little X on a A4 sheet of paper, just an X with one color pen or pencil. And then whatever they see, they mark with an X on the same page. So they go home after the exercise. So 5 minutes for hearing, 5 minutes for seeing, 10 minutes. They go home and they open the nature journal and it's full of X's, blue X's for hearing, red X's for. So we've gone from what we call as a field guide study to now the memory part of it. We're playing it all back in our minds. Okay. That tafakkul, that tadabbur, which is key to understanding the Quranic ayats. So after an hour or 2 hours at home, we then go to all of the X's which we're hearing and we start to rub them out and imagine, what was I hearing? Was I hearing a bird? It sounded like water. It sounded like wind. So you begin to sketch what you heard and then you transfer that to what you saw. So that nature journal becomes alive. We're not after spectacular sketches, but whatever you feel that you can now bring alive, transition to transformation. And then you take that a little bit further, you go back to the location, and then whatever you heard and whatever you saw, you move into the wood, you move into the forest to those locations, and you start to think, yes, I heard a bird in that tree. And now I can see the bird. I don't know the bird. Okay, so now we go into identification and we begin that study. But then you realize, that bird has got a nest. So now we're going from biology to ecology and we start to connect the dots. And that's how we need to study the natural world, the ayats, the Kitab al-Kawn, Book of Nature. And in the same process, that's how we need to study the Quran. Connect the verb, connect the object, connect the subject, and then connect the whole surah. So the whole of the Quran is like one complete organism, and each surah is like an ecosystem. And through this process of sit spot exercises and nature journaling, we're also immersing yourself into the natural world, which is full of ecosystems.
And for a second, you were almost describing my son, who is very curious about the world, right? He's very interested in looking and seeing. Um, is it about redeveloping curiosity and not taking, for example, even and it's not the right word, but taking a simple word like khalaq in the Quran, which is there countless of times, but to not take that single word for granted, but to almost double click on it I have a mouse here, so right, is that the purpose, to go beyond the superficial view of everything you see around you and the Quran as well?
Yes, our ulama teaches that there's 4 levels of Islamic contemplation. That first level is actually to go beyond what 99.99% of people are doing. We see people at the beach, we see people walking in the wood, but they're there, but they're not actually connected. They're there walking, talking for a barbecue, walking the dog. We need to get onto level 1, and that is to be able to observe. Just observe the object in relation to Nahwa and self. Observe the khabar, okay? And once you observe it, then remember that everything in creation, a leaf, a twig, a tree, is an ayat, it's a sign. So the whole of the Quran is a signpost, directing us to what? It's directing us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So look at the object, the khabar, the tree. Is that the purpose? No. So what about the tree? Yes, learn about the tree, the identification of the tree. But then what's beyond the tree? That's when you start to think the relationship, what's going on with the tree? What else is living with the tree? And then you start to look wider and wider at all the other aspects. You start to look at the whole of the ecosystem, the animals, the birds, and the sun, and photosynthesis, and so that takes you on to the next level. And the third level is where you just cross over, and you've left the khabar, you've left what you're looking at, and the relationships that you've with that connecting to the Quran. You have to immerse yourself and understand this is all perfection, divine order, perfectly designed, in harmony, in order, perfect symmetry. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. So when we say Ashhadu Allah, we're testifying, I have witnessed. So when we say Ashhadu Allah, the question is, have we really witnessed? We can't see Allah in this world, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to see his signs. So he manifests his signs around us. So as you go through the Islamic contemplation from the khabar, you get to the highest level, insha'Allah, and this is only by being in the company of the ulama, as-sadiqeen. By then, you've bypassed the tree, the bird, you're just connected to the signs and the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're on this earth, but you're just walking through.
SubhanAllah. Yeah, that sounds like a long-term journey, right? To keep it requires for you to keep investing in your relationship with creation.
Keep investing. Just like, our answers for the state of the Ummah today, as always, is to return to the Quran. Everything that we need to know is there in the Quran. We have to return to the Quran. The Quran is the divine blueprint, but we're turning to everything else. And we hear it every year, okay? It's the month of Ramadan. It's the month of the Quran. And we don't have a relationship with the Quran. And obviously, within the Quran is the Kitab al-Kawn. And, all of these ayats, they form a relationship. And so everything that's happened before, everything that's happening now in the world, and everything that will happen in the future, it's all there in the Quran. So we have to have a relationship with the Quran and understanding that, one day when Allah decides, we are going to be in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's not the prayer, well, although the prayers are there, it's not, the other thing, the only thing that you're going to be accountable for in front of Allah, what Allah says is the qalb as-salim. And we look in English and we think of it as the contented heart. But what does it mean by the contented heart? That's another massive subject, but it comes back to heart C. Okay, the heart is not just a pumping organ. The heart means to think. And remember, if we go to Surah Ibrahim in relation to the tree, okay? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was commanding the Prophet to study the tree. Telling the Prophet himself, study the tree. Why? Because in that is your answer. In that is your answer. Study the fruit, study the honeybee. The Prophet said, be like a honeybee, be like a tree. So even the Prophet is teaching the companions about the natural world. But the difference between them and us, my dear brother and sisters, is they were living the Quran because it was revealed. So when the ayats were in relation to the sun, the mountain, the moons, they were seeing it. It was there. They were living it because the Quran came down in the natural world and the companions were connected to the natural world.
Yeah. SubhanAllah. You mentioned earlier, you said that the first principle of hearts C. So there are multiple principles, I imagine, of heart's sea. What are those? And are they related to this journey of transformation? What are the principles of your organization?
Yes. So the relation to the key principles is the rewiring. So we have to get away from this Western mindset, which is a Descartes, which is a reductionist way of seeing things in terms of silos. It's a crisis of perception of how we're seeing the world, that everything is disconnected. No, it's all connected. And science today is understanding it because now science is saying that's what we have to turn to. It's called systems thinking. But that's how we turn to the Quran. That's the Quranic worldview. So we have to try and move. The first principle is rewiring, to move from the left brain hemisphere, which zooms in, it focuses on like a bird, it will zoom into the seed, but it uses the right brain hemisphere to look holistically at the wider environment for predators. Okay. So left and brain come together, but the world today is dominantly in the left brain hemisphere. From the Islamic perspective, when I was talking and research with Professor McGregor, this is from a satanic perspective, the strategy of Shaitan. But we need to move into the right brain hemisphere because even he agrees that before the 15th, 16th century, the whole of humanity was operating predominantly in the right brain hemisphere. So the first principle is rewiring. How do we do that? By reconnecting with the ayat of the natural world, of course, as well as the Quran. Have a relationship by seeing then and connecting to the four levels of Islamic contemplation and transferring from biology to ecology. Okay, it's thinking outside of the box. And then the next principle is to rewild. Rewild is to be able to see the world, understand that you can't read the world correctly because mankind's operating in the left brain hemisphere. We need to be able to read everything correctly. So we're seeing the world disconnected. We're seeing biodiversity issues and the subject of climate change and ecosystem breakdowns. And we saw that a lot during COVID. And so when humanity was shut away, the natural world came back and regained their territory. So rewilding is about bringing together the habitats, but in the same way, when the habitats are destroyed, that is disconnecting us from the Kitab al-Kawn. It's
Mm.
disconnecting us from the Quran to prevent us from reading the ayah. If, subhanAllah, astaghfirullah, if the Quran was tampered with or rubbed out or destroyed, can you imagine the rage? But when the natural world is destroyed and they are ayah, we don't do nothing about it. So the rewiring is key. And then the next principle is the redesigning. Redesigning our minds, our family, our community in preparation to what? The last principle of becoming the Khalifa, which is our objective on earth, to become the Khalifa. So there are three comprehensive conquests. We sum up Islam in three ways. Comprehensive conquest. Conquest of the self. Understand the self. A comprehensive conquest of the environment, society at large. Okay, that's your tazkiyah al-nafs. And then the third one is the conquest of nature, a comprehensive conquest, not the conquest that is taking place today. And that will maintain that mizan.
It's quite interesting. I've been diving into capitalism quite a lot recently, and there is a similar pathway in there, right? Where,
Yeah.
but the other way around, where first they conquered the natural world and subjugated it to their will, right? To be able to make a lot of profit out of it.
Yeah.
There is a conquest of society, to break down the family, break down cohesion in society. And there is sort of a conquest of the individual, right? Because we can extract a lot of money out of people's attention. So it's very good for us to have there we go, individualism, and have people focused on themselves. Is that a coincidence?
No.
For the okay? Could you dive into that a little?
It's interesting that when the Heart Sea and the ulama are trying, and as we were, what does Allah Ta'ala say? Who are the ulama? It's not what we think. The ulama is something completely different, which the Quran refers to. And so, you know, the ulama of the past used to see the world as a connected whole. We call that systems thinking. The enemies of Islam, those from the current worldview, they also know the system very well. It's all from Shaitan. Shaitan knows everything that's Shaitan knows the divine order. That's why he's trying to do what he can. And so, everything that's happening in the world today is all done on the basis of systems thinking, but they don't want us to understand. They're creating their web, and it's a web of a system, but they don't want us to understand that. And we have to understand there is a relationship between colonization, capitalism, and also climate change. As a biologist, a field guide and tracker, and working in the natural world, I'm just beginning to realize now that all those years when I was working, example, like in Africa as a field guide and tracker, although I was seeing the world, I like to think correctly, I was being misled because we are seeing the world through the wrong lens. The world is a deception. Particularly when we look at the natural world and conservation, it's all greenwashing. We look at, holidays in Africa and all these conservation charities, and you go on safari, and we begin to sort of question why everywhere there's safari parks, there's national parks, whether we're talking about America, Canada, the UK, across across the majority of Africa, Australia. These were colonization countries who have been colonized by the white supremacists. Okay. And if you look at Africa now, and this is happening as I speak to you, that colonization is still going on, and it's still being controlled by the white settlers, and it's called ecological settler colonization. And so all of these safari parks are catering now. They're not interested in the wildlife, because when they entered Africa, the white settlers, particularly initially from going back to the Portuguese and then the British, they wiped out all of wildlife, and they introduced all of the European cattle and crops to serve the capitalist agenda. But then after countries in Africa particularly then began to wake up and go for independence, the white settlers didn't want to lose their land because of the wealth. And so they began to work with the corporate world, as what we're seeing today. And they began to think, we need to play the conservation card. So they played the conservation card and the wildlife hospitals and the endangered species. But then they began to put borders around key areas. And they began to put the indigenous people into small locations. Are we not seeing that across the world today? Are we not seeing that in Palestine and Gaza? I worked with the Israeli conservation team in relation to vultures before becoming Muslim. And believe me, what you are seeing now is ecological settler colonization connected with the same species of vulture that I work with in the most unbelievable ways, and how they're making out now that they are supporting conservation, but they are not. And all of the national parks and safari parks that we go to, under tourism, these are controlled areas. So the ecological aspect of animals, of everything, is not living naturally, okay, according to the universal laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these borders are there particular because that's where all of the natural resources are. So they have become military zones. But we go there in abundance and we pay a fortune in terms of having a nice safari holiday. But it's all controlled and it's only for a certain elite. And this is actually happening as I speak to you now.
SubhanAllah. Yes, it's an agenda of control, right? So these nations wanted control back of their own countries.
Yeah.
The argument was that the native people of their land are not able to conserve these endangered species of animals or plants. So countries are helping them to conserve their either their natural beauty, right? That's the story that we're supposed to accept.
Yes,
But in essence, you're
the
saying that it's
story is Africa hasn't got the ability and the know-how how to conserve the endangered species, the habitat. So it needs the white man, it needs these wildlife organizations to come in and help and invest. But no, everything was working perfectly before colonization, before white men entered
mm,
Africa. And so now across Africa and Australia and part of America, where the world's been colonized, we're seeing 21st century slavery, taking place. So that's why we're seeing all of these conflicts between indigenous people. The Maasai in Kenya, they're fighting back because now they're restricted where they can, you know, march their cattle. And occasionally the white man will just take one black person and put them into a senior position to calm things down.
mm,
But they're beginning to wake up and open their eyes and beginning to connect the dots, like what we're seeing now in Palestine. People are beginning to connect the dots. And I feel in relation to Heart C and our whole aim and objective, this is essential. If you're connecting the dots, as we're seeing people are, Muslim and non, that's your key to understanding, the whole process of looking through the Quranic lens, that we're in a crisis perception of how we see the world, that we're living in a world where the veil has been pulled over the eyes of humanity for a reason.
mm. But it puts it on in a much broader perspective, right? Where there's almost a disillusionment of what we're actually seeing, and what is actually happening in regards to what we're being told. So it's not just our relationship with the Quran and seeing the natural world, but it's also the world view that we have as a result of our connection to nature, but also seeing then understanding that everything we see in the world is connected, right? So these events, these patterns, they're connected and not a separate
Yeah,
separate
yeah,
occasion.
yes, yep, exactly. But back if we just again go back to the whole point of Heart C, it is to teach the Ummah, first and foremost, and humanity, how to read the signs.
Mm,
Reading the signs, the ayat, including the revelation, is not the purpose. It's just signposts. And all, the Quran is like one complete tree, all the verbs, everything. We talk about root letters. So imagine the Quran is like one complete root system. And the connection between earth and Jannah is the trunk. And Jannah, when we look linguistically at the word Jannah, it is the word which describes the interlocking branches. So it's like we're because that's our home.
mm,
Uh, and and so our whole journey is to go to one signpost, understand it, go to another signpost,
mm,
and these signposts, inshallah ta'ala, if we hear and we see correctly, will direct us, inshallah ta'ala, to our purpose on earth. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونِ. I've not created jinn and mankind except to worship me. which will take us towards all of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's signs and his attributes. That's the highest level that we can get to in relation
Yeah.
to Islamic uh, contemplation. We call that ma'rifah, the recognition. We can recognize. So we're walking on the earth, we're doing what we have to do, but we're in a completely different world.
SubhanAllah. Jazakallah khairan, ya Shaykh. A little while ago, you mentioned um, a Muslim polymath, or that the people of the past were polymaths.
Yes.
Um, what does that mean, and what does that mean for us today? Should we become polymaths?
Definitely. We just go back to, the sort of the golden age of Baghdad, the Islamic civilization of Spain, Cordoba, and places like that. When we think of Spain, the golden age, where we established the universities, where people of all faiths, Jews and Christians, came and they lived. And, the world we have today is a result of the polymaths. And this is why we need to study ancient civilizations, because ancient civilizations used to predominantly think through the right brain hemisphere, through systems thinking. And our Islamic civilizations also understood everything in terms of systems thinking and connections, and all of the great ancient civilizations were polymaths. And we're just beginning to learn now that they're uncovering great ancient civilizations and enormous pyramid structures, not what we would think in Egypt, but across Africa, South Africa, Australia, and South America. So these pyramid structures of great civilizations that we read about and we've read about is actually coming to fruition. Allah says that He will continually show them the signs until they believe within themselves and also within the universe and within themselves, which connects to the first and second ayat. And so we need to become polymaths, taking that important last principle of heart. So we need to become the Khalifa, because Allah has created everything in terms of communities. So we need to be able to deal with the globalization, all of the issues, political, environmental, social, economic. We need to understand all of these through the right brain hemisphere and left brain hemisphere. And we can only deal with all of these symptoms by becoming polymaths. That is not specializing in one subject, which we're programmed to do according to Western civilization, which happened from the 15th century to this day. And that is the major issue with our education system and political, economic, social, and environmental, but to become polymaths. So we take a number of subjects that could be related or not related, but everything is related, and to study them in depth. The famous polymath that we would think of and study is Leonardo da Vinci, but we have no understanding of the vast amount of Muslim men and women who were polymaths. And the Prophet himself was a polymath. Okay. So we've got, why are we specialized? You've got to become a doctor. You've got to become an engineer. Well, okay, become a doctor, but become also an engineer and study other areas as well. Okay.
Could you give an example of a famous Muslim polymath in history, and perhaps also
Whoa,
what his fields of study were?
there's so many, and I can't think of one. But if you just look at some of the you caught me on the spot there, but just study some of the senior ulama from Spain, Andalusia, and Cordoba. Okay, that we can turn to for a lot of our Islamic material, but they were polymaths also. Imam Ghazali, okay, he was a polymath. He wasn't, we think of him in terms of Islamic studies, but study his life. He was also studied other subjects. Okay, so that's what was happening before the 16th, the 15th, and 16th century. And so
Mm.
the work that I was doing with the professor in McGilchrist and others was, why has the world changed? And it's because, and from our perspective, it's the strategy of Shaitan, because we're in the end of times. Shaitans had to flip things from the right brain of how humanity and ancient civilizations and other faiths, okay, of seeing the world, to flip it into just seeing it through one lens, which is connecting us, which I was trying to explain to the professor, in connecting us to the understanding of the Dajjalic system in preparation for the Dajjal, the one-eyed. Okay, it's this crisis of perception of how the Dajjal wants us to see and to think on a horizontal plane, but without going vertical, and that explains all of the key principles of heart seek. And this is why I like to continue saying, why don't you see? Why don't you look? Why don't you observe? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not dealing with the eyes and the ears. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to go further, to be able to see and to think with the heart. And the battle today, and it's the most famous quote, it's a battle of hearts and minds. Shaitan knows he has to flip mankind, so he uses the eyes and the ears to attack the heart. And so we have to have a relationship with the Quran, and within the Quran to the Kitab al-Kawn, in order to put up these barriers to defend ourselves from the strategy of Shaitan and ultimately from the evils of the Dajjal. And as times become towards, as time moves towards the end, the battles are going to increase. Hence why Allah says, the only ones that are going to be safe, okay, is those who have the qalb as-salim, the contented heart. We all have to pray. We all have to do our 5 times salah, although we're going to be questioned, okay? We all have to follow the 5 pillars. It's what we all have to do as Muslim. We all say we're Muslim, we've entered Islam, okay? But then, ashhadu an la, have we actually testified? And when Allah says, if you are Muslim, ya ayyuhalladhina amanu udkhulu, then enter, udkhulu, enter Islam completely, externally, internally. And that's the only way that we're going to protect ourselves from Shaitan. So Heartsea is trying to do what it can in a very small way to reconnect humanity to the ayats in relation to the natural world, which will, of course, inshallah ta'ala, connect them and us to the ayats of the whole of the revelation.
SubhanAllah. That's a beautiful mission, Sheikh. Jazakallah khairan so much for explaining it to us, for taking us upon your journey, both in the past and right now. Well, Jazakallah khair for your time. I hope we can do this again sometime.
Inshallah. And thank you for hosting me.
It was a pleasure. It was an absolute pleasure. Jazakallah khair.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
Wa
barakatuh.
alaikum assalam.